of our listeners or viewers are, welcome to the Two Israels podcast. I'm Michael Jaffe, and with me today is Jonathan Feldstein, who...
Pleasure, Michael.
It's a pleasure to have you, Jonathan. You have an incredible background. You have a very remarkable background. Just to introduce you, you live in Efrat in Israel, which is a suburb. Is it, what do you call it, a Jerusalem suburb?
It's a suburb, sure. It's a separate town, but just south of Jerusalem, yeah.
Yep. It is, I think, the largest. No, is it the largest city in Judea?
No, Beitar Illit is larger. Beitar Illit is probably 30 or 40,000 people. We're about 11, maybe 12,000.
Okay. You were born and educated in the U.S. I think you went to Emory. You
Right.
immigrated to Israel in 2004. You are married and a father of 6. And I believe
Correct.
you are a grandfather as well.
I have two grandsons. Yes, it's awesome.
Okay. You are a prolific writer who is published in Town Hall, Jerusalem Post. I'm sure there are others I'm missing. You've had 3 decades of work in nonprofit, PR, marketing, and fundraising. And the thing is, when people might have heard of you in the middle to late 80s, when you were actually, if I'm not mistaken, a person of the week on ABC's Nightline, for people who remember the Ted Koppel days. I think it was almost exactly 33 years ago too, March 25th, 1988.
Yeah, I lose track of the time, but yes, it was the end of March, and it was 1988. And I was much younger and had a lot less gray hair.
Okay, as happens to us all. Now, you were very involved with the student struggle for Soviet Jewry.
Correct.
And then you kind of, I guess, over the years, I mean, Soviet Jewry became less of a critical thing. And you moved to the realm of, I guess, Jewish-Christian relations, or Israel-Christian relations.
Right. That's well said. My very first fundraising campaign ever was in 1985 when I needed to raise $2,000 for my first trip to the Soviet Union. And I began my first formal fundraising position working at what was then called National UJA in 1990. When the walls of the Soviet Union had fallen apart, and Jews were able to leave in Operation Exodus as I don't remember how many billion-dollar campaign it was to rescue a million or more Jews from the former Soviet Union, and that was my first formal fundraising position.
That's amazing. That's amazing. And I mean, if ever there was a humanitarian project, humanitarian political project that really broke the mold, I think it was the Soviet Jewry cause of the, I guess, of the 80s. It started in the 70s, I guess, into the 80s, and in the 90s it became, I guess, it ended. I would say that also the Soviet Jewry struggle was part of what brought down the Soviet Union eventually.
For sure, it had to have been. In fact, I'm still in touch. We do a bit of writing. I've been doing a bit of writing and a little bit of research. You mentioned my work with Christians, where I just hosted a webinar myself with 4 former Jewish refuseniks and telling their story as it relates to Passover and the same concept of slavery, albeit in the Soviet Union was very different, but it was slavery nonetheless, and a liberation of more or less the same number of people who left Egypt. And it was galvanizing. It was quite a galvanizing thing in our day and era, that young people, old people, as the Soviets demeaned us and called us students and housewives. Well, I was one of the proud students, and eventually, when the Soviet Union, can you credit Gorbachev for having the understanding that the Soviet Union model didn't work and needed to be revamped, or was it the pressure from the West that pushed him toward that? I don't know, but we did what we needed to do, and thank God today there are over 1 million Jews who have come to Israel just in that one period.
That's amazing. You are with the Genesis123 Foundation.
Correct.
Through that, you have the Run for Zion. Wow. Now, getting right into it, could you describe Genesis123? I know it's about building bridges between Christians and Jews and Christians and Israelis, but could you describe also how you feel, what you feel is the niche, the unique niche of Genesis123 in the time when we also have, say, QFI, the Christians United for Israel, and as well as the IFCJ, which is the International Fellowship of Christians and Jews. How do you see Genesis123's niche?
Great, that's an excellent question. So in a 30-year career in nonprofit, you see a lot of things, good and less good. And over my career, I've been exposed to any number of organizations as a volunteer, as an employee, that don't fully operate above board, not at a standard at least that I would like. And I was actually relating this to somebody recently, and I'm going to try and make sure I don't mention names. But I was working for an organization at some point and beginning the launching of a program for Christian outreach. And I had a meeting with one ministry in the Bible Belt and came out of it a little uncomfortable with that meeting on a number of levels. So from the parking lot, I called my boss and I said, look, it's not my decision. I'm trying to represent the organization well, and I don't want to do anything or make relationships that could compromise the organization. And there were some serious issues that came out of this meeting that I stood in the parking lot on my phone talking. And after explaining it all, he basically said to me, I don't care what you do, just raise the money. And that didn't sit well with me. And it didn't sit well with me for a lot of reasons. And eventually I left there and moved on and have built my career. But I'm an Orthodox Jew. My relations, building relations with Christians, that's said deliberately, not meant to be redundant, go back to the late 1980s when I was young and single and living in Atlanta and working for the Israeli consulate. And I would travel all over the Southeast. And that was my first real exposure to Christians, Christian support for Israel. I had no idea why Christians would care, much less support Israel and the Jewish people. And it opened my eyes a great deal. But I have been given tremendous privileges. I'm the only Orthodox Jew who's ever spoken at the Billy Graham Library. I had the privilege of attending Billy Graham's 95th birthday party. I write, you mentioned some of the websites I write for. One of the others is Charisma, which is one of the largest Christian media networks. And they've also actually offered me the opportunity, which I'll be beginning probably next month, to do my own podcast as the first Orthodox Jew on their network. So all of these things are not just because I'm a good fundraiser, but because I build relationships. And after working for a couple of organizations that only valued the dollar or whatever other currency I was working in and didn't care about ethics, I decided we would start the Genesis123. And I say we, I'm the president and founder, but I have a board and it's a great mix of Jews and Christians and people from all parts of the world. And the objective, as you said at the outset, is to build bridges with Jews and Christians with Israel, but to do so in ways that are new and unique and meaningful. So you mentioned some of the other organizations that do, and there's a vast number of organizations, Jewish, Christian, secular, who build relations or espouse to build relations and do things. Many of them, honestly, are fundraising operations, and that's fine. I don't diminish that at all. But if the only relationship is the swipe of a credit card or the writing of a check, it's not really a relationship. So when I'm doing things that are new and unique and meaningful, it doesn't always involve a donation.
By the way, I saw the YouTube recording of your recent, I think you had a recent session with several Christians regarding the Passover Seder.
Right.
And I mean, the involvement, the level of personal involvement. And I remember one of the participants, you called her your mama. I forgot the
my bonus mother. Yeah,
your
right.
Bonus mom, Bo mom. And you really do seem to have that personal, very, very personal involvement, and that these people who are involved with you and that are participating in these activities, it's not just with a checkbook. It really is. These people are emotionally involved. They're personally committed. And it does seem to be, as you say, a little bit different.
Correct. And so just prior to speaking to you, I was speaking to a young man in Brazil who's going to help me translate some of our projects into Portuguese, which has always been a goal of mine. And the one that we decided that we're going to work on is called Verses for Zion. Versesforzion.com is our website. And that simply is a way to engage Christian children to study biblical verses that relate to Israel. They're growing up in homes that are pro-Israel, and they hear about Israel in a positive way anyway, and that's very nice. But if they don't, my feeling is if there's not a biblical foundation to it, then it's a house of cards that can also fall very easily. So there's a fundraising element to it, but the young man in Brazil who's going to help me with the translation said, well, I didn't understand the whole fundraising, and is it required for people to give money? And I said, no, we don't want to shut anyone out. If there's a 10-year-old in Texas or in Sao Paulo or in Nairobi who wants to study biblical verses that relate to Israel, and I set a $5 or $10 threshold, and omit that opportunity, then I've not done my job. So it's really nice, and I mentioned that, but one of the programs, honestly, this last year that we just simply stumbled into, I wish I could take the credit for the vision behind it. It was more of an accidental, wild success, is we've now done 4 global prayer for Israel events. The first of which was a 13-hour nonstop event that began in China, ended in Hawaii and Alaska, in several different languages. In China, we had people praying for Israel in Hebrew from an underground church, a church that the state doesn't even recognize the legitimacy of, and therefore they can be persecuted. These are the things that last. That someone feels good writing a check for Holocaust survivors, I don't want to diminish that at all. We do that, but if the only relationship, I referred to this in one of the articles that I'm most proud of, and I wrote for a Jewish website, I referred to it as, it's a great line, I just have to remember it, objectifying Christians as a faith-based ATM. And if that's the sum of your relationship, not good enough for me. That's my standard.
Wow. Okay, I want to shift a little bit to motivations and to talk a little bit about the motivations which I guess spur Christians and Jews to seek common ground and degrees of affiliation. Now, I know that for many Christians, specifically, I guess, Protestants, especially evangelicals and Baptists, they see their blessing of Jews and their blessing of Israel as a way for them to be blessed.
Right.
But some others seem to go even beyond that and seem to see themselves as a grafted, I guess you'd call it a grafted branch onto the tree that is the Hebrew nation.
Correct.
How do you see these motivations? Where do you see these motivations that it spur the people who, especially the Christians who are involved with you, and conversely, the Jews who feel almost a compulsion to seek out these bridges?
Great. Okay, excellent questions. First of all, there's a wide range of motivations, and the two, for example, that you mentioned, being part of the equation that God promises in Genesis 12:3, I will bless those who bless you. You know, God doesn't say, it's not a formula where God says, as he does many times throughout the Torah, do so and so, I am the Lord your God. He doesn't say that. He says, bless Israel and I will bless you. There's a formula, there's an equation. There's not just an opportunity, but a requirement for input. And that input can be in many different ways. I don't want to get sidetracked on that, but from as simple and as grassroots as prayer to hands-on involvement, charitable donations, and many more. And the motivation, it's not a motivation, it's just if a Christian feels grafted in to the Jewish people, or God's covenant really with the Jewish people. That's what we're talking about. So those are not mutually exclusive, it's just complementary. And I see a wide range. I once did a survey, someone who was wrong posited that the reason why Christians support Israel is because of the Holocaust. Well, some do, and many of my Christian friends, of course, repent for the Holocaust, even though they weren't alive then. But they know that the Holocaust and many other crimes that were committed against the Jewish people were done directly or indirectly in the name of the church. So that is a motivating factor, but really the motivating factor is to be one with what God's expectation is, and it's really clear. Mm-hmm. God says, bless Israel. God says, pray for the peace of Jerusalem. And so that is an integral part of who many Christians are, and their connection to Israel and the Jewish people.
Do you think they're looking also for something else? Do you think in addition to that, the way I look at it sometimes, and I follow Christian-Jewish relations because of, because of my project, but do you feel like they're also looking for something else, that there's something almost that has to do with the times, with right now, especially going on in America? And by the way, looking at your board, there are pretty much exclusively Jews and American Christians. You're not seeing a whole lot of, on your board members, I don't know if there are a lot of, say, European Christian board members involved with your group.
Two.
Maybe, okay, but it seems to be, from a person who's looking at the outside, it seems to be largely an American Christian thing. And although there are evangelicals all over the world who love Israel, who support Israel, who come to Israel, especially nowadays and in this season, it seems that it's very largely an American Christian thing.
But
go ahead. Sorry.
Go ahead. No, finish your question.
Okay. The question is, do you see them looking for something because of what's going on socially and politically in America today? That is, you have a real schism between the left and the right. I think a bigger break, a bigger division than you've ever seen before. There are some very troubling questions about culture in America today, especially when you're talking about cancel culture, especially when we're talking about, I guess what Christians would see as a real challenge on their ability to practice their religion in the States now, a real political challenges and real political threats. Do you think that this might be part of that motivation into their involvement in Genesis123?
Look, it's certainly a motivation. There's a kinship, but the challenge, of course, is that many of my Christian friends will say, I remember vividly, like it was yesterday, probably close to 15 years ago, I was sitting in a bomb shelter in Sderot, down near the Gaza border, hosting a Christian group, and there were two questions that they asked me, and one I'm escaping me at the moment, but the other question was, why are American Jews so liberal politically? And it was not meant as a pejorative statement. American Jews are predominantly liberal on the left side of the political spectrum. Evangelical Christians are not. And they didn't understand it because they look to us as Jews with kinship. And it doesn't make sense for many of them, to have a biblical orientation and have that political orientation that's so different. So sure, the political arena makes a difference and drives us closer. I think that many, certainly the role of evangelical Christians in the Trump administration was significant, and I think had a significant role in his decision to recognize Jerusalem as the capital, move the embassy to Jerusalem, the Golan, and other things that I think, in all fairness, whether one likes Donald Trump or not, he deserves credit. But that was the same way I was involved with the Soviet Jewry movement and moved things forward. I can't take credit that Gorbachev made a decision, but there was a movement behind me that I was a part of, and I think that that's probably the same. I do want to just rewind a moment. I think the demographic that you're seeing vis-a-vis my board is predominantly because when I established the organization, it was new, and I'm a dual citizen, born and raised in America. I've spent most of my life there, and most of my relationships are there. So you're seeing the Americanness in me played out in the board. But in parallel, which we can talk about, I have a whole great initiative going on in Africa, and new people coming on board in Korea and in Brazil. So it's not a specifically American thing.
Oh, I understand. I would also, I understand. I'm just saying that a lot of the people who might drive this forward, I think, from what I've seen, not just with your organization, tend to be, there's almost an American initiative to go and to reach out and push this forward. I think that also might be partly the American in you that does that.
That's actually a great observation. That could very well be. For sure, from the American side, that is a contributing factor. And you're right. Christians do feel more. I don't know if persecuted is exactly the right word, but we'll go with it for the time being, and therefore more solidarity with us.
Okay, and that leads me to the flip side of that. What motivates your Jewish members?
They see the vision. There's either a political or cultural or religious affiliation. They understand that, on a good day, all Jews in the world are about 14 million, and you go to one average sized state in the Bible Belt in the U.S. and you've got many times more than that Christians. So so some Jews just see, well, duh, this makes sense. We want to support Israel, and that shouldn't be simply from the sum of the Jews in the world. So that's motivating. But very candidly, many Jews and many of my friends are terribly uncomfortable with it because as I explain to Christians who love us unconditionally and don't understand the history, the negative history of the church, and not only don't understand it, but can't comprehend it because, in fact, it's so anti-Christian, the things that were conducted in the name of the church, that they don't understand why we just don't reciprocate with it, with the mutual embrace. And I tell them, we have a lot of baggage. We have 2,000 years of baggage.
Well, this is because I have a good friend from Texas, and he's an evangelical, and he was telling me the evangelicals have never persecuted the Jews. The evangelicals, the love of Jews is, and he argues that it's even for maybe decades or centuries that they've had that love for Jews. Now, maybe it's the old argument about, well, they're just doing it to missionize and to convert you. Or maybe not, but that's something that I never knew about. There's a certain ignorance I had about Christians as one single category. I mean, I draw a very big, thick line between, say, Catholicism and Reformationist and Protestant Christians, although there are many Zionist Catholics as well.
Yeah,
and I think that might be a newer thing.
It's a newer thing, and it's something that also relates to your earlier question in the sense of political and cultural conservatism, where people see that there is a kinship. Look, I don't think, and I don't mean it in a derogatory way, I don't think that most Jews distinguish between anyone who calls him or herself a Christian, whether it's the Catholic Church or any denomination of Protestant And Martin Luther, toward the end of his life, wasn't so keen on Jews. In fact,
Oh,
right? And most evangelical Christians, I would argue most Christians, don't know that and don't understand that the birth of Protestantism was born with what initially he wasn't so bad, but eventually he advocated for all-out slaughter
yeah.
and purging of the Jews. And so anyone who I share that with is terribly uncomfortable. That is in fact the roots of their faith, or of Protestantism.
Mm-hmm.
And they don't understand that. They don't understand, and they repent for that. But Jews don't understand the difference, and Jews don't understand the same way we have divisions amongst ourselves. Jews don't understand that many evangelical Christians don't consider Catholics to be Christian
At all.
and none of them consider Mormons to be Christian.
Right.
But from a simplistic Jewish perspective, if it has to do with Jesus, therefore it is Christian. And so Jews don't get it. And part of my responsibility, even when I bring tour buses to in the days when people were able to come visit, I open up my home on Shabbat for Christian friends, and we've hosted tour buses that pull into the neighborhood. I divide up the bus among friends and neighbors who are really interested in and inquisitive but don't fully get it.
Yeah.
And it ends up becoming one of the highlights of the experience for both the Jewish host and the Christian guests.
Which leads me to my next question is, what do you say to Jews who distrust the motives of Christians who love Jews? I mean, I saw this recently when right before I saw the YouTube of your Pesach session, your Passover session. Yes. I was on Twitter, which is probably a mistake, but I was on Twitter, and I saw that there were a couple of Jews who were saying, "You Christians, you better not do a Seder, because that's ours." And there's a real big distrust, because of course, I mean, devout Christians will say Jesus as the Passover sacrifice.
Correct.
But what do you say to Jews who distrust them and who see this as a violation or an attack on Judaism?
Specifically regarding holidays and rituals, or
not just that, but just who distrust the motivations when Christians begin to affiliate with Jews? What do you say to them?
So I tell them that they're not as engaged. I'm speaking to Jewish people, and I tell them that they're not as engaged as I am, and they don't know that there's a genuine unconditional love and support. And when I say unconditional, it's not just a nice word, it's unconditional. Mm-hmm. There are people for whom that unconditional love is still somewhat conditional, because as evangelical Christians who believe that the only way to salvation is through belief in Jesus as Messiah, and they desperately want you and I to be in heaven with them and don't want us to be left behind. So they want us to convert, although many people don't call it converting, they call it being completed, because that's a whole...
I never heard that one before. Completed.
Right.
Completed Jews.
I have good friends who call themselves completed Jews, and I differ with them theologically. I love them dearly. But I've been told by people who actually, ironically, don't even know their own theology properly, Jonathan, you need to get down on your hands and knees now and accept Jesus as Messiah, so you'll be saved. Saved meaning going to heaven. And I know it comes from a position of love. It kind of rolls off my back now. So there are people like that, but they're in a minority. We can draw a bell curve, and I can tell you that there are a small number, a relatively small number who are like that, a relatively small number on the other side of the bell curve who don't feel that at all, who feel 100% kinship with us and understand that we have the original and unbreachable covenant with God. And there are a lot of people in the middle who don't know, or a mishmash, and might be confused, but want to be part of the dialogue because God says, bless Israel. Mm-hmm. And it's fascinating. I get into really awkward conversations with lots of different people, but I don't shy away from them. I just try to be respectful. I don't ever want to be offensive, but it's really awkward to tell Christian friends that I don't need Jesus, because from the day I was born to a Jewish mother, I was part of the covenant, and 8 days later had a little surgical procedure that Abraham did on his sons, and my salvation, if you will, is through the Torah and the commandments that God gave to Moses.
I think there's a famous story, I forget the particulars, but about a Christian meeting a Jew, or a famous Jew, I don't remember who, I think it was a famous rabbi, early in the 20th century. And the rabbi indicated, listen, we don't need the son. We have a direct line to the Father, basically. So yeah.
And it's awkward. It's very awkward for Christians who understand that through various Christian scripture, that the only path to salvation is through Jesus. And so where appropriate, I engage those conversations. I'm not trying to change anyone's mind. And by the way, that's a pillar of the Genesis123 Foundation. We approach one another respectfully, but from our respective traditions. And we need to understand that. And if we disagree on a couple of pretty key things, okay, we still agree on most others. Mm-hmm. And I can live with that very comfortably.
Very nice. Okay. Now many of your Christian members have been to Israel numerous times.
Yeah.
Probably more than the typical American Jew. Well, I think
also
that the typical American Jew doesn't go to Israel.
Correct.
So how do they see, when they go to Israel, I'm sure that they like to see the Christian sites, the Stations of the Cross, I imagine. They go up to the Galilee, they go to the River Jordan, perhaps they visit Bethlehem, well, Bethlehem's not in the Galilee, but they go to Nazareth, I imagine. But do they ever get to see Israeli society? I know they visit your friends, and maybe they have a Shabbat dinner. Do they ever get a familiarity with the ebb and flow of Israeli society?
So the answer is yes, some. By the way, that goes to another motivating factor is that you asked about earlier. A lot of Christians understand that in many ways, and it's a harsh word, but I'll use it, that in many ways Christianity was hijacked almost 2,000 years ago, and Judaism was purged from it. So now there's this whole movement among Christians to understand what Judaism is about, because they know that it's the foundation of their faith. They know that Jesus was born a couple of miles to the northeast from where I live, and lived a few dozen miles further to the north, and lived his life as an Orthodox Jew, and celebrated the Jewish holidays, and his place of worship was the temple, which I can see the place from my balcony, but we're not there at the same time. So that is a motivating factor for many people. So as to your question about connecting with Israelis, there's a organic movement that takes place. A lot of Christians will still come on what's traditionally a pastor's tour, but they're opening up. They're pastor's tours that don't just get on and off the bus to see various holy sites, but in fact engage with us.
You know, that's really interesting that you mentioned that, because you mentioned that seeking the Jewish roots of Christianity is actually more than 400 years old now. That movement, it was called Christian Hebraism in the 17th century, and it informed the American founders. It was very much a part of the Edmund Burkes and the other philosophers who were dealing with the question of monarchies, who then eventually informed, both not only the Calvinist pilgrims, but the American founders, who used that narrative, both the Exodus narrative, and, by the way, I don't know if you knew this, but they also used the Purim narrative, because at one point they did not look at the King George as the worst thing. So they were thinking that there were a lot of people in power in the aristocracy in Britain who were exploiting the colonies in ways that they wouldn't want to happen in Britain, and they blamed them instead of the King George. Of course, that changed, and eventually the Purim narrative became the Passover narrative. Which is very interesting because it follows right after that, in the calendar as well.
I never heard that. That's fascinating.
That I'll tell you, that comes from a book from a relative by marriage to me called Eran Shalev. And I unfortunately don't have the book with me right now. It's called American Zion. and it's really quite amazing. The degree to which the Jewish narratives, even though these people didn't necessarily like Jews very much, that narrative was very important, which brings me to something else.
Sure.
And again, in case you might not have realized it, I have the project I'm involved in is the shared narratives between specifically American Christianity and Judaism and the Hebrew narrative.
Okay.
And so you have this connection with the Jewish narrative, and I'm wondering that is there something with American Christianity that more strongly taps into the narratives that you can see with the people with whom you interact?
I didn't follow the question.
The question is more among the American Christians with whom you deal, and I think you do deal mostly, maybe not exclusively, but mostly with American Christians.
Right.
Do you see, is there something in their Americanism?
Oh.
And could this thing have to do with, and I wouldn't call it a DNA, I might call it a cultural DNA, but I guess I would call it a cultural DNA. Is there some cultural DNA that you can recognize, that you sense, that has them affiliating, affects their motivation to affiliate with Israel and the Jews?
Well, the answer is yeah, for sure. Especially in Texas, where a lot of people love. I always bring greetings from the original Lone Star State, and that's always well received. But of course, whether Americans are appreciative of the incredible democracy and the history of the American democracy, and understand that in the whole Middle East, there's only one country that really is democratic.
Yeah.
We're messed up. Our democracy is, I don't know, it's on a variety of drugs right now, and it needs a little detox. But
we could spend an entire program on that.
We could spend an entire, well,
because you know my view on that.
What's your view?
My view is it's not the people, it's the system. The system promotes this, and until Israel changes of what I would consider a very collectivist approach to this, it's not going to change, and it wouldn't. And the cast members don't matter. The script is there.
Well, some of the collectivism worked well at the beginning.
Well, you needed it,
but we needed it. But now, we're a mature teenage country in comparison, but nevertheless democratic, and Americans see that, and Americans who are whether deeply religious or just understand that there's a biblical foundation also connect with us. Going to your question before, I think a lot of Americans see that the opposite of that is also true, which is the enemies are common. Now, are the enemies common? Does Iran hate us both because the U.S. supports Israel, or does Iran hate America independently of Israel because America is the antithesis of an Islamic Sharia society?
Right. Well, there's a third
Okay.
factor. Do they hate Israel? I mean, Jews were subjugated in many Islamic countries.
Right.
There's dimitude.
Right.
And the question might be, do they hate Israel also because of maybe this is what you were saying, because of the ethical, values-based opposition or challenge to Islamic hegemony?
Well, and the fact that they view the land, we may be in a different phase now, and it'll be interesting to have this conversation in a year, 5 years, and 20 years from now. But still, it's safe to say that probably the majority of Islam considers us occupying a land that, even if they acknowledge once upon a time we had a presence here, they conquered it, and therefore that makes it Islamic, and therefore our hegemony here, our return is antithetical to Islam.
Yeah. We're seeing that melt. I mean, Saudi Arabia, the Emirates.
That's the point.
these are religious, somewhat theocracies. So yeah.
Big
We're
time.
about to run out. Jonathan, we have maybe, I think, about 2 minutes according to my
Okay.
calculations. So there were 2 quick points I wanted you to touch
Sure.
on. Firstly, I can see what, do you think there's some kind of value-driven, some value proposition that Jews are getting from Christians in the Genesis 123? That's the one question I have. And I think you started to mention that the Jews see value in it, but I'm also wondering if they see almost like a philosophical value to it. And the second question, which is going to open up a whole lot of things, is what do you see can you apply your model and your kind of approach to Muslim-Jewish relations?
Okay. So as wide as the range of perspectives as Jews have in Judaism and Jewish philosophy and Jewish tradition, you have Jews who see value added and don't. I do. I love and I cherish the interactions that I have, and I try and share that with people. Certainly anyone who ever wants to be in touch with me about that, I'm happy to share more. As to relations with Muslims, look, that's doable. Islam is certainly monotheistic. I have a rabbi friend who's spoken about the common foundation that we have with Christians is that 80% of their Bible is our Torah, and Islam doesn't have that. Doesn't have that at all. In fact, and I don't mean it in a pejorative way, but Muhammad kind of copied and pasted and picked and chose different elements of Christianity and Islam and Judaism, which were the predominant monotheistic cultures in the Arabian Peninsula when he was alive. There's certainly a commonality. I don't know that it's fair to say that all Muslims are our cousins, according to the lineage of Abraham and Ishmael, but there's certainly a commonality, and there should be efforts to build bridges. In college, I became very good friends with a Syrian medical student who hated Israel and who loved Meir Kahane because he said, if I were Jewish, that's how I would think. Mm-hmm. And I felt it was important to build bridges with Muslims, and it still is. It's just not part of what we're doing with the Genesis123 Foundation, or that's my particular orientation.
I see. Well, I think that's I think that's pretty much all I have to ask at this time. I'd like to, Jonathan. Oh, Jonathan, is there anything that you'd like to bring up that we didn't cover?
Just anyone who wants to be in touch, you can visit Genesis123.co. Contact, learn about what we're doing. These are conversations that can go on literally indefinitely, mm-hmm. and I'm always happy to engage them.
Thank you. Well, I'd like to thank my guest again, Jonathan Feldstein, for coming on to the Two Israels podcast, and perhaps we can do this again.
With pleasure.
Okay, thank you, Jonathan.